USS Cyclops. In March 1918, the USS Cyclops, a massive 542-foot United States Navy collier, was tasked with transporting 10,000 tons of manganese ore from Brazil to Baltimore. The ship carried 309 crew members and passengers. The vessel made an unscheduled stop in Barbados to load more coal for the journey north. After leaving the port on March 4, the ship completely vanished. No distress signal was ever sent from the radio room. No wreckage, oil slicks, or lifeboats were ever found floating in the Atlantic. The United States Navy conducted a massive search operation along the entire eastern seaboard, yielding absolutely nothing. To this day, the disappearance of the USS Cyclops remains the single largest loss of life in U.S. naval history, not involving direct combat. The ship simply ceased to exist. Michael Rockefeller. In November 1961, Michael Rockefeller, the 23-year-old son of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, was traveling through the remote Asmat region of Netherlands, New Guinea. He was collecting indigenous art and artifacts. While crossing a wide, turbulent river mouth, his heavily loaded catamaran was swamped by rough water and overturned. After a night clinging to the overturned hull, Rockefeller strapped 2 empty gasoline cans to his waist for buoyancy. He told his traveling companion, "I think I can make it," and swam out into the miles of muddy water toward the distant shoreline. He was never seen again. A massive, heavily funded search by the Dutch government found no trace of him. While the official cause of death is listed as drowning, persistent local rumors claim he reached the shore entirely exhausted, only to be killed by local tribesmen. The Bennington Triangle Disappearances. Between 1945 and 1950, a heavily forested area in Vermont near Glastonbury Mountain became the site of 5 completely unexplained disappearances. The most famous case occurred in December 1946. Paula Weldon, an 18-year-old college student, signed out of her dorm to take a hike on the long trail. She was wearing a bright red coat. Several people saw her walking up the trail, but she never returned. Law enforcement scoured the woods, but found no clothing, no tracks, and no body. Exactly 3 years later, in 1949, a veteran named James Tedford boarded a bus heading to Bennington. 14 passengers saw him sleeping in his seat. When the bus arrived at the terminal, Tedford was gone. His luggage remained in the overhead rack, and an open bus timetable lay on his empty seat. None of the 5 people who vanished in this region were ever found. Raoul Wallenberg. In January 1945, the Soviet Red Army laid siege to Budapest. Trapped inside was Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat who had risked his life to save tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews from the Holocaust by issuing them protective passports and sheltering them in designated safe houses. When the Soviets secured the city, Wallenberg went to their military headquarters to discuss the protection of the civilian population. He was immediately arrested by Soviet counterintelligence on suspicion of espionage and sent to the notorious Lubyanka prison in Moscow. He vanished into the Soviet prison system. In 1957, the Soviet government released a document claiming Wallenberg died of a sudden heart attack in his cell in July 1947. However, multiple prisoners released from the Gulag system in the following decades who reported speaking to a Swedish diplomat in various labor camps long after his supposed death. His true fate remains a state secret. Ambrose Bierce. In 1913, Ambrose Bierce was one of the most famous writers in America, a hardened Civil War veteran known for his deeply cynical writing. At the age of 71, he decided to cross the border into Mexico to witness the Mexican Revolution firsthand. He traveled to the city of Chihuahua and embedded himself as an observer with Pancho Villa's rebel army. On the 26th of December, 1913, he wrote a letter to a close friend. He stated that the idea of dying in bed of old age was terrible, and noted that being put against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags was a good way to depart this life. That letter was the last communication anyone ever received from him. No record exists of his death, no body was ever identified, and his final resting place remains entirely unknown. The Sodder Children. On Christmas Eve 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, a fire broke out in the home of George and Jenny Sodder. The parents and four of their children managed to escape the burning house. Five children remained trapped on the upper floor. George ran to get his ladder to reach the upper windows, but the ladder had been stolen from the yard. He tried to start his two coal trucks to pull them up to the house, but the engines had been tampered with. The house burned to the ground. When investigators sifted through the ashes the next morning, they found no human bones. A fire chief claimed the children were completely cremated, but scientific experts stated a typical house fire does not burn hot enough or long enough to destroy human bone structure. The Sauter family went to their graves believing their children were kidnapped by the local mafia as retaliation for George's outspoken political views. Louis Le Prince. In September 1890, a French inventor named Louis Le Prince was preparing for a public demonstration in New York. He had successfully built a single-lens camera and recorded the first actual motion picture years before Thomas Edison. Le Prince boarded a train in Dijon, France, headed for Paris. He checked his luggage, entered his private cabin, and locked the door behind him. When the train arrived at the station in Paris, the conductor found the cabin door unlocked. The cabin was completely empty. The windows were tightly shut. Both Le Prince and his heavy luggage had vanished. An exhaustive search of the train tracks between Dijon and Paris turned up no body. Because Le Prince could not travel to America to secure his patents, Thomas Edison was able to claim the invention of the motion picture for himself. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse. In December 1900, the relief ship Hesperus arrived at the remote Eilean Moor Lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. The island was completely silent. The lighthouse door was closed, and the entrance gate was shut. Inside the living quarters, the keepers' beds were unmade, the mechanical clocks had stopped, and a single wooden chair was overturned near the kitchen table. The three experienced lighthouse keepers were gone. The official logbook detailed a massive, terrifying storm that had battered the rock for days, describing the men as crying and praying for their lives. However, weather stations on the nearby mainland recorded calm skies and mild weather during those exact dates. The only damage found was a supply box, smashed by heavy waves 100 feet above sea level. The bodies of the three men were never recovered from the sea. Harold Holt. On the 17th of December, 1967, Harold Holt, the sitting Prime Minister of Australia, went for a weekend drive to Cheviot Beach in Victoria. It was a location known for rough surf and violent rip currents. Despite the dangerous water conditions, Holt stripped down to his swim trunks and walked into the ocean. Witnesses on the beach watched as he swam out into the deep water. Suddenly, the turbulent surf washed completely over his head, and he disappeared from view. One of the largest search and rescue operations in Australian history was immediately mobilized. Police, Navy divers, helicopters, and local volunteers scoured the coastline for days. They found no trace of the Prime Minister. Flight MH370. On the 8th of March 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed Kuala Lumpur, heading to Beijing. There were 239 people on board, the Boeing 777. Less than an hour into the flight, as the plane approached Vietnamese airspace, the pilot signed off with air traffic control. Immediately after, the plane's communication systems and transponder were manually disabled. Military radar tracked the aircraft, making a sharp, calculated turn back across the Malay Peninsula. The plane then turned south, flying straight into the vast, completely remote southern Indian Ocean. Satellite data handshakes indicate the plane flew for several hours until it completely exhausted its fuel supply. Despite a multinational search covering 46,000 square miles of ocean floor, the main fuselage has never been found. Only a few scattered pieces of washed-up debris confirm the plane went down. Jimmy Hoffa. On the 30th of July 1975, Jimmy Hoffa, the powerful and deeply corrupt former president of the Teamsters Union, drove his green Pontiac to the Macus Red Fox restaurant in a suburb of Detroit. He was scheduled to hold a peace meeting with two known mafia capos, Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone. At 2:15 p.m., Hoffa called his wife from a payphone behind the restaurant to complain that the men were late. That was his last known contact. When police arrived the next day, they found Hoffa's car in the parking lot, entirely unlocked, with no sign of a struggle. Law enforcement and the FBI operated on the absolute certainty that Hoffa was murdered by organized crime hitmen to prevent him from taking back control of the Union's pension funds. Despite decades of digging up fields, searching incinerators, and tearing up concrete foundations, his remains have never been located. Mary Celeste. In December 1872, the Canadian ship Dei Gratia spotted an American merchant brigantine, the Mary Celeste, drifting aimlessly in the Atlantic Ocean near the Azores. A boarding party went over to inspect the vessel. They found the ship in perfectly seaworthy condition. Its cargo of 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol was entirely intact. There was a 6-month supply of food and fresh water in the galleys. The crew's personal belongings, pipes, and clothing were still sitting neatly in their quarters. However, the ship's single lifeboat was missing. The captain, his wife, his 2-year-old daughter, and the crew of 7 seasoned sailors were completely gone. There was no blood, no sign of a mutiny, and no indication of a pirate attack. The 10 people on board abandoned a perfectly sound ship in the middle of the ocean and were never heard from again. D. B. Cooper. On the 24th of November, 1971, a man using the alias Dan Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 inches Portland, Oregon. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a flight attendant a note stating he had a bomb in his briefcase. He opened the case to show her red cylinders and wiring. He demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. The plane landed in Seattle. The FBI delivered the money and parachutes, and Cooper released the passengers. He ordered the pilots to fly toward Mexico at a low altitude. Somewhere over the dark, freezing, rain-soaked forests of Washington state, Cooper opened the rear air stair door of the Boeing 727 and jumped into the night wind. In 1980, a young boy found a small, rotting bundle of the ransom money buried on the banks of the Columbia River. The hijacker himself was never found, and his true identity remains completely unknown. Amelia Earhart. On the 2nd of July, 1937, Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, were attempting the most difficult leg of their flight around the world. Flying a heavily modified Lockheed Electra, they took off from New Guinea, aiming for Howland Island, a tiny flat strip of coral in the massive expanse of the Central Pacific Ocean. A United States Coast Guard cutter was stationed near the island to provide radio navigation. As Earhart approached the area, she encountered heavy overcast clouds and severe radio transmission issues. At 8:43 a.m., the ship received her final, frantic transmission. "We are on the line, 157337. We will repeat this message. We are running on line." She had stated earlier they were running out of fuel and could not see the island. The plane went down. Despite an immediate, massive naval search ordered by the president, no confirmed wreckage has ever been pulled from the ocean. The Roanoke Colony. In August 1590, John White anchored his ship off the coast of Roanoke Island in modern-day North Carolina. He was returning from England with vital supplies for the colony he had founded. He had been delayed in London for 3 years due to the naval war with Spain. He expected to walk into a bustling settlement, holding his daughter, his granddaughter, and over 100 English men and women. Instead, he found a ghost town. The settlement was completely abandoned. The wooden houses had been carefully dismantled and removed, proving there was no rushed evacuation or violent massacre. White found no bodies and no graves. The only physical clue left behind was a single word carved deep into a wooden fence post: Croatoan. It was the name of an island 50 miles south, inhabited by a local Native American tribe. A massive storm forced White's ship to abandon the search and return to England. The fate of the 115 colonists remains the oldest unsolved mystery in American history.